Hey guys, some of you may be wondering where we've been, what we've been doing. Whew. So I had planned on posting the week of New Year's and sharing with you guys all about what was going on and some of the things we were looking at for the future. And we were given COVID for Christmas. So we have been sick. We took about 2 weeks to get over COVID, and there are still days where I am just so tired and I am not able to do all the extra things. So we have been focusing mostly on family for the past bit, but I'm excited to be back with you guys today and sharing with you some awesome things about our kitchen and what happens in here. Hi guys, and welcome back to Rooted Hearts Homestead. This week, instead of sitting upstairs and telling you about things that I think should be a part of a homestead and make our homestead what it is, I'm down in the kitchen because we are talking food. One of the big things that I have worked on with having a homestead, with growing my vegetables, raising my own meat, and having kids is also nourishing our bodies with what I am growing and providing for my family. So one of those adventures was sourdough bread, and this has been a full year now of me making sourdough bread. It was so scary for me to start. I didn't understand it. I didn't know what I was doing, and I thought, okay, how do people do this? Turns out it's not as scary, but it's a little bit mathematical. You have to understand how, what, and why. So I am going to work on kneading my bread. As you can see, we are in the middle of process. I have the salt sprinkled on top, and I got to knead the bread in. So I'm going to pull up my flour here and get going on that while I talk to you about food. One of the things that I think is really important with food is being willing to try new things. We do a lot of different foods at our house, and we try different styles of food, and one of the things that took us out of our comfort zone was going country by country and making different foods from that country. Now, this was a part of our homeschool curriculum, so it was easy for me to say, oh yeah, we're making this for school. We found out that we like some things that we would have never thought of making. So being willing to try different things is really important, and just finding things that work with what you have. Another part is having willing participants. If you don't have people who are willing in your household to try new and different foods, then it's going to be really hard to try different foods. But if you're not willing to try different foods, then grow things that you are going to use. One of our main things that we grow are tomatoes, because I use a lot of tomato sauce. We make our own pizza dough. We have pizza probably every other week. We have pasta every other week with a red sauce. So these are things that just yummy food-wise we can have and make very easily. I also think knowledge is super important. Know what nourishes your body. Take the time to look up and see everything that you need to have your body in its optimum condition for what you're doing. Besides nourishing our bodies, it's just really fun to know that I grew this and then I made something really cool out of it. Instead of having something that I bought at the store and I was like, oh, look, this cool thing I made. It just takes it to the next level when you grow your own stuff and then you also create something from what you've grown. Now, obviously, I do not grow flour. That wouldn't be worthwhile for me on the small acreage that I have to grow any sort of grain like that. But I have a local food store, Country Life Natural Foods, that I get all of my flours from in bulk. Since our kids, the younger ones at least, we found out have gluten sensitivities, we said, okay, what can we do to change things? And one of the things that we could do was to do sourdough bread made with spelt flour. So I'm going to give you a quick tutorial on how I do my bread. As far as my starter goes, what I like to do for starter, once it is going, I pre-bought a starter that somebody else had on Etsy. This gal who has starter ready to go and explains to you how to hydrate that starter. I got a rye starter and a gluten-free starter, knowing that I wanted something that was going to be simple to take care of and that our family could use quite easily. Once the starter got going, I learned how to feed it. Now, for my household, for the temperature that we keep it at, what I do for starter is very simple. On baking day, which usually happens 2 to 3 times a week, I put in 50 grams of my old starter into a clean container. Right now I'm using these really cool Crocs, and I really like them. They're wide mouth at the top, so I'm able to mix and then really see what I've got going on inside of them. Then, after I add my 50 grams of starter, I add 60 grams of flour. Now, usually with all starters, people are going to say that you want to use a 1:1:1 ratio. So if you use 50 grams of starter, you're going to want to use 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. With Spelt, it's a little bit different. Spelt takes a little bit more flour than regular all-purpose flour that you would get that's just a wheat flour. This is an ancient grain, so you got to remember it has less gluten in it than the other flours in the store. After I add 60 grams of Spelt flour to my starter, I then add 40 grams of water. And this water is room temperature or a little bit warmer. And that is how I feed my starter. I end up with 150 grams total in it. The days that I am not baking, I feed it a little differently. And it's kind of eyeballed at this point. I do a heaping 1/4 cup of flour, and then I just put in a splash of water and mix it until it's the right consistency. The consistency I'm going for is a thick pancake batter consistency. So it's more together versus less, and I just add water till I get to that consistency. Like I said, on my baking days, I redo my starter every single time. I used to use mason jars because I wanted to see it grow and make sure that it was growing properly. But now that I understand what I'm doing better, I'm able to just use a solid crock. Now to talk about the bread recipe that I use. My bread recipe that I use, I have tweaked and adjusted and figured out exactly what works. I never felt like people explained bread enough. The biggest thing to remember is that it's delicate and you can break it. But with a little bit of practice, you shouldn't. So I start my bread by feeding my starter the previous day, just like I would on any off baking day. Then I come in the morning of between 9 and 10 o'clock, and I take my starter, and since it's a baking day, I completely redo it. I put it in clean containers. I get the 50 grams of starter, 60 grams of flour, 40 grams of water, mix it up, put that to the side. I then put 60 grams of starter in a container. Now right now, I like using these containers right here because they're easy and simple. These are kind of big for what I'm doing today, but this was the one that was clean and available. After I add 60 grams of starter, I then put in 250 grams of warm water. This water should be right between 100 and 105 degrees Fahrenheit. I then put in 15 grams of honey. I stir that and let it all absorb together. After that, I add 425 grams of Spelt flour. Now, you can add 420 grams of Spelt flour, and then in your next step, add a little bit more and a little bit more if you find that your Spelt flour is a little hard to work with. As a reminder, Spelt is not wheat flour. Spelt flour is different, and we have to treat it differently. Normally, I would only put 400 grams of flour into this bread, but because it's Spelt, we're putting 425. After we mix that together, I like to do it with a spatula. I then put on top of that 10 grams of salt, and I don't mix that in. We're gonna let that rest for an hour, so you cover it. With these containers that I'm using right now, I have lids, so I just put the lids on. Once it has rested for 1 hour, I then take it and I knead it all together. Now for this, because it is Spelt, I found that I have to add extra flour. I want to add extra flour until it's not sticky anymore. That's what you've just seen me working on, is making this the texture that I want. So what we're looking for when we are doing that first knead is we are looking to make it not as sticky, but soft. So we don't want to add too much flour. So I add just a small handful at a time until I reach my desired consistency. Once the bread is soft, I then take it and I put the lid back on, or I cover it with a wet, damp towel. And I'm gonna let this sit for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, I'm gonna come and I'm gonna stretch it, I'm gonna pull it, and it'll be quick. It will not be something that takes a long time. I'm not looking to knead my bread again, I'm just looking to stretch out the fibers. I'm gonna do that 3 times. After I finish those 3 30-minute stretches, I'm then gonna let it sit for about 6 to 8 hours. I'm looking to see it rise and double and grow. We're able to keep our house at a pretty consistent temperature. So I honestly just stick this in the warmest room of the house, which is the kitchen, and I let it rise. Sometimes I'll even stick it near the stove if it's a cooler day, but most of the time it's fine just rising on my counter. Once it's done its 6 to 8 hour rise and you've seen a noticeable almost double, I then take the bread, I dust it with flour, and I shape it. How I do this is really simple. I just tuck the edges around until it creates what we call a boule. A bread boule is just a round loaf. I put it onto parchment paper and stick it back into my containers. Again, at this point, I'm going to cover it again. Leaving it covered every time that it rises allows for the bread. I use a warm towel to cover it, or a lid. It keeps all of that heat and moisture inside, and so the bread doesn't dry out. Once it's shaped and put back in the container, I let it rise again for another 2 hours. After 1 hour, I take my pots that I'm going to be baking it in. Now, I'm going to show you these pots. The first one is a typical Dutch oven. I only use this for baking. You can tell it's got bread junk in it. This is one of them. The other pot I use is a cast iron Dutch oven. What this allows for is for me to put them in the oven at 450 degrees with a convection oven. If you don't have a convection oven, you're going to want to put it in at 500 degrees. For my convection oven though, because it has the airflow going around, I do it at a lower temperature to make a better bake so it doesn't burn. I put them in my oven after an hour of these rising when they've been shaped. At that point, what I'm looking to do is to preheat the Dutch ovens. I want them as hot as possible so when my cold bread hits the heat, it goes boing and bounces up and it's a nice tall loaf of bread. I stick it in an hour before so that the cast iron is thoroughly heated through. I probably could do it at 45 minutes before, so if you're not exactly at the 1 hour mark, don't fret. It just needs to be really hot when you're doing it. After that hour has gone past, so now we've let the bread rise for 2 hours and the pans heat up for about 45 minutes to an hour, I then score the bread. It's about 5 minutes before I'm putting it in the oven. Some people score it before that, but I find that if with scoring my bread, it is best done right before. I take my loaf and I just slice 2 slashes in the top. You want to make sure that they get down about 1/2 inch. And as long as you're going down about 1/2 inch, it'll work out well. Sometimes your bread will still crack and you won't get those pretty designs that you're after, but for me, the flavor is more important than the pretty design on top. I then take the temperature of the oven down to 400 degrees or 450 if you're doing a regular non-convection oven. And I put the bread, parchment paper and all, inside of the Dutch ovens and put them in to bake for 20 minutes. After the 20 minutes, I'm going to remove the lids. I should see the spring happened. It should be high and beautiful and gorgeous. It doesn't always happen every time. I have found, though, that as long as you're allowing your bread to rise and be a little soft, a little bit of spring back when you push it, when it's raw and ready to go, it's ready to go in the oven. So you can gauge it based on what is actually needed for your house temperatures. Sometimes things take a little bit longer, so you may find that you need 2.5 to 3 hours for your second rise versus just the 2. After the first portion of the bake, I'm going to bake them a second time. Now this is to not get the spring, but to actually bake the loaf through. I'm going to lower the temperature of the oven again. This time we are lowering it to 380 degrees for a convection oven. Or if you have a conventional oven, you're going to lower it down to 430 degrees and you're going to bake it for 25 minutes. At this point, when your timer goes off and you look at your bread, it should be crusty on the outside, have a nice spring that it's completely sprung up, and maybe even have a little bit of a golden hue to it. May have a lot of a golden hue to it. Depends on how your oven works. And these are all things that you can kind of play around with and say, if I put it in the back corner of my oven, I get more of a burnt. If I put it in the front corner of my oven, I get not even a browning. Just to understand how your oven works. Because mine's a convection oven, I'm able to put 2 of the cast iron pots in at the same time, and it cooks evenly because the air is circulating around with a convection. I absolutely love convection and learned about them when I was working in a commercial kitchen. After that 25 minutes, you're going to take your bread out of the oven and you are going to put it on a cooling rack. Now remember, your cast iron pots are really hot, so your Dutch ovens you do not want to touch them, so you want to be super careful at this point. I just remove my bread, parchment paper and all, and put it over on my cooling rack. After I put that on my cooling rack, I let it sit. Do not touch it. It is finishing its baking cycle. It needs to cool down so that it doesn't just crumble on you when you're trying to cut it. I know we all enjoy hot bread, but if you're not wanting to have a crumbly bread, you need to wait. After it's cooled down for about an hour and a half, it's time to enjoy it. I hope you've enjoyed this small tutorial of how I make my bread, and I'm looking forward to sharing more food with you guys in the future.